I've come to see the national security and the online culture war as all one system, essentially. But I didn't see it that way at the time. I was totally baffled by Gamergate when it happened.
This is probably the first instance of this subculture that had been brewing that now is the eye of Sauron is like, whoa, wait a second. We can't have people organizing online with opinions we don't like.
Yeah, people who are threatening to us directly.
Yes.
You know.
You're telling me it's not just about truth in gaming journalism? Wait a second. Sorry, I'm joking. I do like how we've turned Gamergate into literally the casus belli of like the entire fragmentation of the Western political sphere. Like literally, historians 1,000 years from now are going to be studying Gamergate like we studied
Fort Sumter, baby. It was the opening shot of the war.
You know, it's deeply disheartening, but I think it really was very significant. I think that it really implanted this idea. It's only years later when I saw the ways in which that Gamergate framework had been absorbed into the discourse of extremist violence in the US that was then used to license surveillance by the security state, that was used to license punitive measures against Americans exercising constitutionally protected speech, that was used to install government monitors inside of the social media companies. You know, that was what made me recognize its salience in retrospect.
Jacob Siegel, you're a writer at Tablet and Unheard and others as well. And welcome. We're excited to have you. Glad we finally made it happen.
I'm glad to be here.
Antonio is likely not joining, but sometimes he makes a last-minute appearance.
That's okay. I saw the Balaji episode, and you guys did fine without him. So
yeah, it's great. It's great. Are you a Balaji fan or?
I am. I'm a Balaji fan, and I thought he was in rare form. That was really good.
Yeah,
that was. I guess it's the sort of standard Balaji in a sense, but very lucid. I thought the red, gray, blue analysis was, at points, he got into some stuff. The red-gray alliance I thought was really interesting. So very good.
Yeah. I think Gray Tribe is one of his better ideas, and one of his more palatable ideas, because you don't have to be. Balaji often gets knocked for being anti-American, or that's what people call him, or anti-America. Mm-hmm. But the Gray Tribe has no indication of that. So
no, but it's going to have to overcome a natural and considerable resistance from the Red Tribe if that alliance is going to be actualized. I think he takes for granted that the cultural and ideological affinities would manifest in an actual political working relationship, and I think that would take a lot of work.
Yeah.
I would add also I think Gray Tribe isn't very inspiring. Like I get the distinction from an intellectual standpoint, but like who wants to be gray? Red and blue evoke emotion, and so I think, I think this goes back to there needs to be the translation. If you think of Curtis as kind of like purely kind of theory, intellectual, and Balaji is much more practical, and I think more maybe optimistic, right? Like you don't have a clear pill or black pill or any of that. I think the retail version of Balaji's Gray Tribe is the thing that people need to find or create, right?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but if the branding on Gray is too appealing and too charismatic, it draws attention in a way that I'm not sure makes sense tactically to the power of Gray. It seems to me like I assumed, I guess, intuitively that he picked Gray as a way of downplaying the sort of the leadership role. I mean, it's a funny thing to say that like the tech billionaires would be the gray men in this scenario, but in a way, it seemed to be what he was getting at in part, like the sort of infrastructural facilitators of the societal rebuild instead of the charismatic leaders of it.
I guess just like play it out. Are there any sports teams that are gray? Are there any flags that are gray? It's funny you mentioned The Gray Man. It's a great book, but like to me, gray is associated. I feel like some drab office in Washington D.C. or like the FBI is gray, or like, and so, and it's less of critique of Balaji as much as it's a yes and. It's like, how can you take the insight of the idea and package it in a way, totally non sequitur in some ways, but like Obama, the hope poster, like what is the equivalent for the gray tribe? That is the level of retail that you need for that, I think, to be able to drive it as an actual movement. And that's one thing I think about EAC, effective accelerationism, a little too jargony and in some ways a little cringe. But I think that the spirit is right, and there is a set of propaganda is probably not the right word, but the fact that there's this whole group of Twitter accounts that are generating kind of with Midjourney future inspired posts and imagery, right? Like whole Mars catalog, and there's this other one, I think, smoking something that Elon follows, and you have all these kind of like inspirational images of humans colonizing the stars. That I think is getting towards something that people can be inspired by, versus I think the gray tribe frame feels very tactical in terms of like, this is how you would actually go about doing it. But I don't think it is going to draw people in. And maybe the counter is, if you're just effective, people don't care and they will attribute gray as a positive thing because it's getting results. I think it's just making it harder if it doesn't have that kind of retail, easy pitch, inspirational component.
Andreessen's been using EAC lately, right? He's picked up on this too.
And Gary Tan, yeah.
Yeah. I've followed the accelerationist discourse for a long time, so it's a strange journey that it's taken.
Yeah, I mean, even that accelerationist doesn't feel like the right. That feels like it's like Lenin almost in some ways. It's like heighten the contradictions. Let's move forward.
Well, it started off as a left-wing critique of that,
right?
As the term was coined by this British academic critiquing Nick Land, critiquing what he saw even at the time, Benjamin, not Boyce, something like that. Anyway, and it's just passed through all of these different mimetic stages, and like now for Andreessen to be using it is just a very strange evolution. But the imagery certainly is like powerful and palatable, and like building big things and making things work, and sort of the tech with grandeur to it. I mean, I'm personally more concerned with like tech at a human scale, whatever that means. But tech with grandeur has real, I think, emotional appeal and resonance for people.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's interesting that, and Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, the idea of abundance, I think that is actually a very powerful, simple thing that the average person can understand, right? You say the word abundance, it conjures up Thanksgiving, overflowing food, right? Like it's just like, oh, there's more than enough for everyone. It is a positive sum, something enabled by technology, right? If you actually look at the track record of technology over the last 200 years, it has enabled abundance, whether that's food or obviously the internet, but energy abundance, right? It's actually a reframe of climate change, right? It's like degrowth is actually what climate change is rooted in. Abundance is we are going to engineer our way out of this. We are going to have more energy, 10, 100x amount of energy that we have today. We can desalinate the world. We can suck the carbon out of the air. And I think that is actually a powerful message from a retail standpoint. And even in California.
Connect that to jobs with good wages and security, and you've got everything you need. If the abundance is only consumer abundance, there's a problem. If the abundance is a integrated society, not integrated in the fullest sense of the word. I mean, and that, that sort of like mid-century, you are part of an industrial economy that also provides you with the material conditions to raise a family and have some expectation of security. That to me is a like really bringing it all together, politically salient, working message for all this.
I think what's important about it is it appeals to both sides. It's a bit of a Rorschach test. Is you say abundance to progressive, right? If Ezra Klein is talking about this, that's obviously important. They're thinking high speed rail in California and YIMBYs like win and we're building smart housing policy. And you say abundance to kind of a right winger or free market capitalist, we're able to go build all the stuff that we want to build. And so in some ways it's the sclerotic, administrative state, which I think maybe is a good jumping off point for our discussion today, is being beat by the smart progressives, the abundance oriented progressives that say, hey, we should be able to build a mile of subway at the same cost as Spain. And Spain has plenty of safety net. Like, what are we doing in New York that's making this so expensive? And then on the other side, it's like we should be able to go build all the, startups and companies and the SpaceX's and Andurils of the world should be able to exist as well. And so I think that also it sells to the progressive that's really educated. It sells to the free market capitalist, but it also sells to the immigrant in California who is here now and wants abundance for their family, right? And it's like, I want good education, I want housing, I want a quality job, and I want to work hard. That abundance mindset, I think, is a really powerful frame, because who's going to argue against abundance outside of some degrowther who has no constituency?
I'm pro-abundance. I'm definitely not anti-abundance, and I agree that that's an appealing message to a broad constituency. But given that there is a fairly recent, well-documented record in America of periods of putative abundance where GDP is increasing, it appears that there's economic growth occurring, but for reasons having to do with the combination of the structure of the political economy and also government regulation, the share of that abundance going to working Americans starting in the 1990s dramatically decreases, and the share going to to shareholder profits dramatically increases. To make that pitch appealing politically to not just sort of policy wonks, but to working Americans, requires that the abundance is structured in such a way that it's built around a, first of all, conception of the national interest, which we've only just begun to recover as a acceptable political framework in the last 5 years, right? The sort of Trumpian nationalism renormalized, and to your point about there being a broad consensus around abundance, progressives, liberals, whomever you want to take as your sort of typical person there, Ezra Klein, Iglesias, whomever, can now talk about a national interest, can now talk about, whether it's in terms of some kind of industrial policy or whatever it is. There's an ability to talk about this explicitly now without being, without a pall of sort of racism or xenophobia hanging over you. I think it was Klein who famously did the interview with Bernie Sanders in 2016 for Vox, where he's like, open borders is good, right? We should all want open borders forever. And Bernie Sanders, and this is still the Bernie Sanders of 2016, who's a sort of, at this point, still a halfway unreconstructed left-wing populist of sorts, is saying, no, open borders is a Koch brothers conspiracy, right? Now, look how far we've come since then. Bernie is now completely subsumed into the Democratic establishment. He's just functioning as a kind of, excuse me, a shill for the Biden administration at this point. But on the other hand, I think that a Vox writer could sort of make a national interest case for abundance at this point. So I'm definitely in favor of a politics of growth, which I think is not only good in terms of generating wealth, and in a very basic sense, good for people. It's also, degrowth is never going to be an American value. It's never going to take root here in a real way. So it's always going to be a sort of just ideological fetish of sorts. This country is not built on degrowth, obviously, and it's not in the national character. But you need a growth that benefits American workers. That's how I see it.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Compliance doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, with Vanta, it can be super simple. Trusted by over 5,000 fast-growing companies like Chili Piper, Patch, Gusto, and Juniper, Vanta automates the pricey, time-consuming process of prepping for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more. With Vanta, you can save up to 400 hours and 85% of costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/zen. That's netsuite.com/zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/zen.
I think that's a good point. So 2 things. One, to go back to the Bernie 2016 and now where Bernie is. One thing, I've been listening to the Elon Musk biography on my way to work, and I just finished the chapter talking about the Obama administration's approach to private space. And I actually didn't know this story. And I think it's really indicative of how much we've changed in terms of maybe the polarization. And I think there are a bunch of examples of this with Obama, right? Like if you kind of think about the average Trump voter thinking Obama is this kind of, caricature of a progressive, when in reality, like comparing kind of where Obama was relative to the Biden administration, I wouldn't really say Biden is driving the ship there right now. But he got a lot of heat for basically following a deputy staffer at NASA who wasn't part of the military industrial complex, kind of the revolving door from like Boeing and these launch companies that were all on cost plus contracts, to allow SpaceX to have a contract for shuttling. And this is in 2010, when SpaceX had only done 1 or 2 flights, and it sounded preposterous that this startup that had blown up multiple rockets was going to be moving astronauts to the International Space Station. Fast forward a decade, 80% of global payloads are SpaceX, like compared to everybody else in the world. So it was like a phenomenal success. And Obama actually went down and did a photo op with Elon Musk in front of a SpaceX rocket. And so to imagine today a Democratic politician showing up in front of anything that Elon would be working on, whether that's obviously the leading electric car manufacturer in the world or SpaceX, is just so outside the kind of norms. And so I found that Bernie anecdote reminded me of this, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit. It's like Obama should get a lot of credit for actually where we are today with space. That was a good policy, regardless of what you think of him as from a political standpoint. But we just, now it's just everything gets turned into, oh, it was Obama, so if I'm a right winger, I think that's bad, or something that Trump did automatic because Trump is an abhorrent human. I have no ability to reason. You mentioned the kind of like, how did the American worker benefit? The one way I would kind of disagree a little bit on that is that famous cost chart, right? So you have the electronics. Obviously, an iPhone is a great example. How many consumer electronics that existed prior to a smartphone did an individual, you'd have a camera, you'd have, a flashlight, you'd have a calculator, all these different things that now you don't buy. It's kind of this consumer surplus that comes with a supercomputer in your pocket that's reasonably affordable for most Americans, just given the penetration. Compare that to housing, education, healthcare, right? So the thing I would push on is, I think I agree with you in that the average American has had an increase in cost on a bunch of different categories, but a part of that is that those categories have been kind of protected by the maybe traditional kind of like government bureaucracy, whether that's kind of in the unions or just kind of like very protective set of laws. And I think the SpaceX example to me is amazing in that the rockets, we went to the moon, 1969, and basically haven't been back in 50 years. And it's taken a kind of breakthrough from a private company to actually reinvigorate US space travel in a way that they are actually making money in the free market, right? Like SpaceX is actually a profitable, on a unit economic standpoint for launches, they're not getting subsidies. Compare that to the, United Launch Alliance or whatever that barely can put things up into space. And to me, that military industrial complex is similar to the kind of housing complex, the healthcare complex, and things like that.
Well, hold on, because that military industrial complex also launched a lot of these companies, or was crucial in facilitating the launch of a lot of these companies that are now producing these breakthroughs in the supercomputer in your pocket. So I don't think they can be so, there's not a strict dichotomy between free market entrepreneurialism and the military industrial complex. And we could go through the government alliances and carve-outs for virtually every single one from Google, and people always harp on In-Q-Tel, but the Google government relationship is much more extensive than just that, and there are carve-outs for Apple and for all these companies. So I think that the balance, though, that we're trying to strike is between a government approach that promotes entrepreneurialism and innovation, but to my mind, that combines that with some regulatory bureaucracy on the other side of innovation to protect American workers. And I was about to put it in a somewhat disingenuous way. I was going to say, you could say that would be a break on, growth, but it's not that you could say it would be a break on growth, but that's fine in my opinion, because an economy exists to serve a nation, not the other way around in my way of seeing the world. So or a sovereign political entity, if you prefer that, a state, if you will. So the purpose of the government is not to decrease all friction and restrictions such that the economic engine can achieve its apotheosis free from any political obligations or social obligations, nor is the government's role to place onerous political and social obligations on free enterprise. The period that you're talking about when we went to the moon, 1969, is the the peak of the period that combined these two things most effectively. You know, the post-war is a lot of criticism and sort of backlash against like the post-war order these days, as it were, you know, and some of it is fine. It's a sort of healthy revisionism occasioned by the manifest failures of that order in recent years. But these were, in particular, the first 3 decades after the end of the Second World War were periods of phenomenal growth, the explosion of mass affluence. And that occurred in an environment, especially in the US, that maximally combined pro-innovation policies. Some of this through getting out of the way of the free market, some of this through finding ways to sort of stimulate and sponsor. I mean, the internet, of course, famously comes out of ARPANET, right? And the National Science Foundation. And so there's a combination of this, but it's balances that innovation and entrepreneurialism with a, you know, somewhat protectionist framework that allows workers inside the United States to benefit from this mass affluence such that they can then participate in the society where this affluence is occurring, and that creates a stable social foundation for the country.
So I think that's a fair point. And I don't want to come across as kind of like government could do no good. I think, if anything, the massive amount of military industrial, you know, Cold War spending in that 30-year period resulted in a phenomenal amount of kind of consumer surplus, technological surplus, entrepreneurial surplus, however you want to kind of categorize it. Whether it's the most efficient spending or not, that actually is less interesting to me. But I think the analogy I would say is it's almost like post-World War II, you have this fertile, massive amount of, you know, land, field, whatever you want to call it, and you can go plant a forest. And so the forest can just do phenomenally well because there's no existing canopy, and the government can actually come in and fund things and set up the structures, and you end up growing this massively successful, you know, tall, old growth forest. But if you actually don't have forest fires every once in a while, you don't have natural ways of kind of tearing down maybe some of these existing structures. So if you do what California does, where you basically don't allow any of these things to be logged or whatever, then you get these just kind of like, A, you don't have any new growth, and then B, you get even worse forest fires. And so I think that there has to be some natural, and I think the SpaceX with the Obama administration is a good example of that, where even just a small tweak, it has now allowed, I think, a massive new industry to grow and a lot of innovation to happen. NASA is still very fundamentally involved, right? Like a lot of the money that actually came to help SpaceX, that $1 billion plus contract, was government funding. So I think, to your point, I think that there is a balance, but the version of the world where the government is going to do everything is, I don't think, right. And then the version of the world where there is no involvement of the government, you know, free market, Galt's Gulch type situation, that obviously doesn't work. And so I think it's fighting over what the right balance of that is. And to your point is like, how does the average American worker benefit? And I think what's challenging is in the 30 years post-World War II, high school education was sufficient to actually have a pretty good job, right? You get a factory job in the Midwest, work at an auto company, have a really good pension, kind of be part of a thriving civic society in a whole bunch of towns, you know, in a place like Ohio. And in a world where globalization has occurred, people have moved stuff overseas, to your point, because of, you know, maximizing shareholder value. The people who benefit in the abundance that has been created in the world of bits, not atoms, have to be more educated, white collar. And so I think that disparity, and this is something we've talked about on the podcast before, and it's an issue that I don't have a good answer for, but is how do you deal with an 18-year-old who's probably not well suited for college, an 18-year-old male? What should they be doing in our society today? And if we don't have an answer to that, to your point about the social fabric, that is going to break down. Like,
we had an answer to that.
Okay, so that would be interesting, because I would say an AGM usually would chirp in here, and maybe you will, is in a country like Israel, they send everyone into the military.
I mean, Israel, unfortunately, in my opinion, is over leveraging its tech sector. It's a difficult bind for Israel because the tech in Israel is obviously strategically vital for Israel, the ability to leverage high tech. So it's difficult. But Israel also has some private sector middle class left, right? And you know, I basically agree with most of what you said there, but until it gets to the part about what do we do with people who can't compete in a high stakes information economy, and that the loss of the jobs that used to employ the people who couldn't work as coders was a deliberate series of policy decisions. And you can go back and read the political and economic officials who were leading those decisions at the time. They're very explicit about the fact that this is going to be difficult, but we'll be trading up and achieving a new equilibrium. We'll get rid of these factory jobs, but in the future, people will be retrained so that they can participate meaningfully in the information economy. And I don't think that those people saying those things at the time did so cynically necessarily. I think they really believed that, but it was a enormous gamble to make. It led to a decline in real wages for something like 60 million people in the country. So it had enormous consequences, and it didn't work out that way. And so not only did people who had been employed, this sort of the factory job becomes like the archetypal job we talk about being outsourced. But of course, there are all these middle management jobs that also leave when a large firm gets outsourced, or it gets automated for that matter. Jaron Lanier, has the famous example of like when you replace Kodak with Instagram, there are all these sort of the accountants, the lawyers, like all of a sudden you go from a firm that was employing, maybe 40,000 people to one that employs 1,000. What do you do about that? One of the things you do is that, to come back to my original point, is you structure your economy in such a way so that it serves the people in the country whose political sovereignty goes toward protecting that economic structure. So you don't make a decision to simply outsource all these jobs, or to try and place everything in sort of international arbitrage. You do have a degree of regulation, restriction, that countervailing power from labor unions. These are, of course, there's endemic corruption, and of course they can be abused, and they can produce effects that not only retard economic growth but end up being bad even for labor. All of this is true, but on balance, it's preferable to simply discarding tens of millions of people and then saying, well, we have no more jobs for you in this economy. Well, those jobs still exist. It's just somebody else is doing them somewhere else. The structure of the American economy no longer supports that. I think some of what the Biden administration has done is a half step in the right direction, though I don't put that much stock in it, frankly. I think there's a lot of sort of the gestures don't actually add up to all that much, in my opinion. But look, Elon employs a lot of people, right? So it's good. To come back just for a moment to like the surprising thing about the Elon Obama White House relationship, in in the lens through which I'm looking at that is less about Democrats and Republicans and more just based on my own interest in this particular history, is more about the narrative about tech and political power, and tech and particularly progressive political power in America. And the period when that alliance was formed that you're describing is a period when actually, Obama had famously run the Facebook campaign, right? The meetings between the Obama State Department and the Google, they set a new record for how often they were meeting. It was, I think, an average of twice a week. The back and forth of personnel between the Obama White House and Obama State Department and Google set a new record. So this was the last period when political progressives in the U.S. and the sort of center-left Democratic establishment in the U.S. was all in on tech still, because it believed that there was a sort of inherent alliance built in. I think the way they saw it was that tech, being a disruptive, progressive force in the world, was drawing, people who may be libertarian leaning, but who tended to be at least progress oriented and to favor, technocratic solutions. And that matched perfectly with the Obama White House approach to politics in a lot of ways. So this was the last moment when that alliance was really sort of in full bloom. And then, of course, 2015, 2016, the rise of populist movements, allegedly occurring through manipulations of social media, a mischaracterization in my opinion, but that was the assessment of many people in the sort of center-left establishment, broke that alliance, not only because it showed that the tech platforms were not inherently left-wing, but also because the center-left progressive political leaders like Obama, like Clinton, viewed that as a direct betrayal of their own payments into the growth of big tech, a direct betrayal of the years they had spent cultivating these alliances. Hillary Clinton, when she was at state, was speaking, effusive in her praise for the revolutionary power of social media to democratize the world. One of her top aides famously compares Twitter to Che Guevara, thinking that this is a positive thing to say about Twitter. He means it as a compliment, that this is like the Che Guevara of tech. And so when it turns out that, actually in a democracy, other kinds of people, bad people with bad ideas, black hearts, can also use that tech. They saw that really, I think, as a profound betrayal.
Wow, a lot to unpack there, and I think very well said. There were a couple of things that I wanted to make sure we touched on. So one, you brought up the Kodak example, which I think is actually really important to just kind of consider, because it ties into actually the half measure you mentioned about Biden. So Rochester, New York, if you've ever been to Rochester or Syracuse,
I've spent a lot of time in Rochester.
Yeah. So not a place most people would want to go move on their own, but thriving economic engine in an era when Eastman Kodak was a, kind of Dow Jones industrial, like core part of the American economy, a lot of innovation. But to your point, not only do you have all these kind of people within the company, but the auxiliary, right? So, in a world where Kodak is actually manufacturing things in Rochester, you have the cottage industry of all these little, small businesses that are feeding into the kind of big company, all of the, as you mentioned, the lawyers, the accountants, but just the economic engine for that entire area is there to serve, right? A restaurant can only exist in a world where you have Kodak executives going to spend the the large amount of money. I mean, if you Google Kodak now, the headquarters in Rochester, New York, the Kodak Tower, beautiful building. Like, and if you've been to Rochester recently, like there's nothing there. But what's interesting is there was a New York Times article talking about how Chuck Schumer, as part of the CHIPS Act, is very focused, obviously senator from New York, funneling money to this once great region from a technological standpoint that got beat by the internet. And so I think the attempt of like how can we actually kind of reinvigorate these once great areas, I don't think it's actually the right set of policies, because I don't think, outside of if the money dries up from the federal government, I don't think you're going to have that much of a competitive. It's not like you're going to be building that same level of ecosystem in Rochester, New York again if they put an Intel plant there as a result of some tax break, right? As soon as that is done, that they're going to limit the amount of investment that's there, and then move it to a lower cost state, right? And New York, I'm sure, has really high kind of fixed costs for an average employee, and people would rather put it in Texas, like Elon is doing. I think that the tech point that you made in terms of tech and Democratic alliance, right? So you have Howard Dean and then Obama, where they were the tech forward candidates. What's interesting to me is that Trump, to my knowledge, I mean, it seems like now with the Twitter files, it probably was actively adversarial with Twitter. But the fact that he was able to just use the tool himself, right? It's not even like he had staffers tweeting from his account. It's just a guy with his phone using the tool, and the power of the tool is kind of interesting in the sense that I don't even think that Twitter, it was actually, I think, more influential for Trump in the sense that his tweets created the media cycle, but the company that got blamed for it was Facebook, because there was this kind of bogus Cambridge Analytica story that was an easy thing, and then obviously Zuck has been hated by the left for the last 5 years until a new enemy has shown up, Rocket Man. And so now that Rocket Man is even badder than Zuck, you now have an enemy of my enemy as my friend, and you have the journalists going to Threads and praising how great the platform that they had spent the last 5 years talking about how Meta was the reason we were stuck with Trump. It's just, I find it very ironic in a lot of ways.
No, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's consistency is not to be found in any of this. I mean, a bare a thread of intellectual integrity is not to be found in most of this. The decision, I shouldn't say the decision, the pressure campaign against Facebook, which Cambridge Analytica had a lot to do with that. And, anybody who hasn't reviewed what the British courts found when this was tried in the British courts, and who still believes that Cambridge Analytica could deliver on this, very lofty set of promises to do precise psychometric analysis, should just review what came out in the trial, which was essentially that these were marketing claims, and that, this sort of nightmarish, like Philip K. Dick dystopian version of Cambridge Analytica was just PR material. It never existed. So that certainly had something to do with it. I think also, though, that there was a very fundamental, very profound shift in the thinking of the political establishment, which came largely from the defense establishment. And this occurs, really the pivotal event is the sort of popularization of the idea of hybrid warfare that begins in 2014. 3 events take place in 2014. So I wrote this essay about disinformation, information war for Tablet magazine called A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation. And I have a section in that on hybrid warfare, and I talk about these 3 events that took place in 2014. And there's a 4th that I'll add now. So the 3 I talk about there are Russia's invasion of Crimea, the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, and ISIS both taking Mosul, capturing the northern Iraqi city of Mosul, declaring its caliphate there, and doing so through a very globally uh, you know, this lurid global social media campaign that really captured a lot of attention and seemed to herald something new in warfare. And even more so, actually, in the case of Russia's response to Euromaidan and then invasion of Crimea, which relied on these influence operations conducted via not only social media, but also, internet channels. And so those three events popularized the idea of hybrid warfare in the defense establishment, which had actually been kicking around since the Israel-Lebanon war as this rather vague, amorphous term to refer to modern warfare that combines conventional and unconventional tactics. And then in 2014, it really added cyber as the main component. So now hybrid warfare was referring to the way in which effectively Russia, ISIS had used the internet, had used information operations over social media to the standard military doctrinal term would be prep the battlefield. So like in conventional warfare, before you send the infantry in, right, you hit the enemy with artillery first. And that's called prepping the battlefield. You're essentially weakening their defenses before the infantry goes in so that the infantry can maneuver more effectively and can mass what's known as fire superiority. So these social media campaigns were the equivalent of prepping the battlefield because they were thought to demoralize the enemy such that when the Antonio, how are you? Right in time. Talking about hybrid warfare. So they were thought to demoralize the enemy so that then when the Russian irregular soldiers, the men in black uniforms or Russian regular soldiers arrived, there would be less resistance. So those, and the same with ISIS, that, and there's obviously some truth to this, if you tweet enough beheading and brutality images, it might scare some of your enemies. Now, it also might rile them up to defend their towns. So much of the sort of theory of hybrid warfare was always, frankly, overinflated and inconclusive, but that was the idea. The fourth thing, which I don't mention in the piece, but in some sense was more influential on the domestic political audience in the US, was Gamergate. And Gamergate convinced the political and media class, really the media class actually more than the political class, media class and the nonprofit class. So the narrative forming and class that influences the political discourse and decision making. It convinced them that there was a dangerous counterinsurgency that had found a permissive environment on sites like Reddit and on social media, and they were using that permissive environment to spread dangerous forms of domestic extremism. And I mean, that sounds like an absurd, caricaturish way to describe what started off as like a jilted video game guy, a lover writing a rather unhinged, weird letter to his ex-girlfriend, which is the actual origins of Gamergate. But that's really how it was seen in sort of political counterinsurgency terms. So those four events come together and they popularize this conceptual framework of hybrid warfare as a form of conflict that observes no boundaries between online and in real life, that passes back and forth through this these porous screens of ours. And that represents a threat both to democracy itself, to civilization, as ISIS showed, to the NATO alliance, as Russia showed, and to the stature and safety of political elites political and social elites acting as the defenders of vulnerable minorities, which is what Gamergate showed. That framework gets absorbed from the defense establishment into the political establishment and really informs this response, which coalesces immediately after Hillary Clinton loses the election. So the pressure campaign on Facebook begins instantaneously when victory is declared for Trump. And it begins instantaneously in a way that tells you they had actually been working on it for months because all the pieces were in place. So just to name one example, immediately after the election, an organization no one had ever heard of before called the International Fact-Checking Network gets a story planted in Politico saying, hey, there's a dangerous tide of fake news and misinformation, but never fear, Mr. Zuckerberg, we can help you, right? We are here, the International Fact-Checking Network. And the whole thing has the aura of like a real legitimate thing. Like there's really a cadre of fact checkers out there, but if there's no such thing, it's totally astroturfed. It's a political operation essentially. And it's in place, and Zuckerberg, after initially resisting, wilts in the face of this pressure campaign, and the IFCN ends up installing its cadre of fact checkers inside Facebook. So that's how that story ends, and the prep for that occurs through the popularization of hybrid warfare.
So I love that it's the Facebook's Supreme Court, right? It's like these like all these Illuminati, PMC, like more credentials than you could ever imagine. You never heard of these people, and they're officially the ones that make the decisions for Zuck, despite his super voting shares. And this is why I think Elon drives them so crazy. Is now the kind of media class social network of choice, or at least used to be, is run by a king, and a king who does not share their respect for the establishment in that regard. I think, Jacob, we have a few let's say chat group friends who actually point out Gamergate as this pivotal event, and I know you kind of gave a little bit of a summary, but I don't think most people, and frankly, I have a hard time like going like, wait, how did this weird video game subculture thing actually become the pivotal moment in changing the perception of the media class? And so is there any more you can expand on that? Because it just seems so strange, because you imagine that the average journalist would look at someone who plays video games as probably someone they don't like, or they would make fun of them, or whatever. But the fact that this thing actually had an impact, like there are very smart people that I talk to on a regular basis that are like, Gamergate was the start of all of this.
My parents didn't even let me have a Nintendo as a kid, so I'm not an authority on gamer culture. But it's interesting. When I took a job in the Army, I got back. I was in Afghanistan in 2012, covering national security at the Daily Beast in 2013, and then very quickly I combined my job covering national security stuff and veterans affairs issues with coverage of digital ideologies, as I called it at the time, sort of online culture war stuff. And so it's come full circle, because I've come to see the national security and the online culture war as all one system, essentially. But I didn't see it that way at the time. I was totally baffled by Gamergate when it happened, and it was only years later I was able to piece it together. But as best I can understand, here's what happened. There was a woman who designed a video game. I'm forgetting her name now, but she designed a sort of boutique video game, let's say, not to appeal to a popular audience, but part of this sort of indie video game crowd that was becoming popular at the time through Kickstarter. And these were video games that sort of video game critics liked. I'm sort of repeating things I've read. I don't consider myself an authority on any of this. But so she created those kinds of games. And then she was like, she had an ex-boyfriend who accused her of like sleeping with somebody or another. It was some kind of like combination of cuckoldry and various forms of sexual shame and lashing out. But he ends up writing this very long letter attacking her, which also, frankly, I'm realizing as I try to recount this, like I'm lost in the lore. The important thing to understand is what it ends up triggering is this broader conflict between self-defined gamers who, as I understand it, see themselves as defending not this particular guy and his psychodrama with his ex-girlfriend, but defending video game culture writ large as not being as it is accused of being by the sort of media establishment, defending it on the grounds that it's a normal pastime and not some kind of bastion of extremism and misogyny and racism. And they are then under attack from the sort of video game critics narrowly, but more broadly, liberal media establishment that has taken the side of this video game designer woman who's the subject of this scorned email, and then on her behalf essentially launches this larger crusade against gamer culture as being, one of these hotbeds of systemic white supremacy and misogyny and all of the sort of various, like all the sins on the list of 21st century Calvinism, the things that people can't be forgiven for. And so in this battle, the gamers acting as sort of effective networked insurgents, to borrow a term from John Robb, they organize campaigns targeting advertisers. They're actually fairly effective at organizing a kind of networked insurgency. And they do this, they're, doing planning online. And I wrote some stuff at the time about the early sort of nascent alt-right that didn't mention gamers at all, but put me on their radar because, I don't know, I was like criticizing 4chan and they didn't like that. So I don't have any deep sympathies for these people on a personal or a political level for that matter. But what you could see in retrospect was that the framing of this as, the evil racist gamers versus the enlightened progressive defenders of women was one of these bizarre pseudo events that seems to take place with increasing regularity in American life. What it triggered was a series of sort of consolidations on the part of the PMC media narrative forming class to prevent such insurgencies, from weakening them again in the future by effectively targeting them. So there's an attempt to purge such activity from sites like Reddit, an attempt to surveil and censor it out of existence on sites like Twitter and Facebook, and a sort of like battening down the hatches and doubling down on the position of infallible moral authority from the media class that had found itself in this embattled posture and responded in a way that was bombastic, but also sort of like any classic sort of aristocratic class, like seeing the peasants forming, they built moats and they boiled the oil to get it ready and all that stuff, but nothing in that at the time seemed consequential to me. I should say, I don't want to pretend like I saw this as a politically significant event when it happened. It's only years later when I saw the ways in which that Gamergate framework had been absorbed into the discourse of extremist violence in the US that was then used to license surveillance by the security state, that was used to license punitive measures against Americans exercising constitutionally protected speech, that was used to install government monitors inside of the social media companies. That was what made me recognize its salience in retrospect. Sorry, that's a long-winded explanation.
No, well said. And I think like just a couple of observations. If you've ever played online an FPS game, right? I'm young enough that I did do that a little bit where there was online. It's a cesspool of like the worst things you could possibly say because you've taken a bunch of teenage boys who have repressed whatever, and they get to do it now anonymously with violence. So obviously, if you've ever been in a locker room talk, it's even more exacerbated in video games. And so the fact that that exists, sure, but to the point of 4chan, Reddit, this is probably the first instance of this subculture that had been brewing that now is the eye of Sauron is like, whoa, wait a second, we can't have people organizing online with opinions we don't like.
People who are threatening to us directly.
Yes.
You're telling me it's not just about truth in gaming journalism? Wait a second. Sorry, I'm joking. I do like how we've turned Gamergate into literally like the casus belli of like the entire fragmentation of the Western political sphere. Like literally, historians 1,000 years from now are going to be studying Gamergate like we studied
Fort Sumter, baby. It was the opening shot of
it's deeply disheartening, but I think it really was very significant. I think that it really implanted this idea in people and established some of the institutional connections between the extremist monitoring nonprofits and the media that then were really influential in 2016, 2017.
So sorry for joining late. There's a bit of drama at home, and as you can tell, the sound isn't great, Jacob, but glad to finally meet you, I think, face-to-face. I'm sure we've talked before. We also secretly operate with the same Jewish cabal called Tablet Magazine. So true or false, Jacob, you mentioned your service in Afghanistan. You were an Army Ranger. Is that right?
I am Ranger qualified, which means that I graduated from Ranger school, but I did not serve in the Ranger battalion. So that's a distinction that'll be unbelievably meaningful to like 24 people listening to this, but it means that I went through a tough school. I didn't serve in a super elite unit.
Still badass. I don't have anything close to that.
Oh, it is badass, and I'm very proud to have a Ranger tab, but it's they're sort of two different worlds.
I've looked on Army forums. I know the distinction is a big one. Maybe you've already asked this, Erik, but you're in Israel now, right? Are you speaking from Israel, Jacob?
I am, yeah.
Oh, cool. I was there a few weeks ago, and I, in fact, wrote a piece for Tablet about it that caused a little bit of a stir, I think, in Israel. I haven't even made Aliyah yet, and I'm already disliked by certain people, which maybe is probably one of the most qualifying things.
Yeah, no, I thought that piece was really good, and I get the sort of left secular perspective, but I don't get the tech perspective. So it was interesting for me to see from those people directly, because I get like my relatives saying to me, "We'll lose the tech people if this happens," but I hadn't heard it from the tech people directly in that way.
I was actually there on like a business trip because we did a partnership with an Israeli company, and one of the unnamed people that hosted me was actually our business partner. So it's slightly awkward to come out and using them as talking points in a piece. Although they encouraged me to. Literally the first, just to go to the piece and be engaged in a little bit of autoerotic self-citation in the piece. Like I literally on the first day, I'm totally jet lagged, and like I get dragged to these protests that are going on in Jerusalem. On Shabbat, of course, as seculars would, of course, do it on Shabbat. And so off I go, not being Shomer Shabbos, obviously, and participate in some of the protests. And I was there with the business, and they actually encouraged, like, you should go home and write about this. It gets to one of the pieces you wrote, right, which is that, I mean, Israel above almost every other international issues, but in the United States, every foreign issue is seen as an extension of an American domestic political neurosis, right? Like literally the entire world exists as like a Plato's cave reflection of like an American presidential election, like in the American mind, of course. In reality, of course, it does not. But and in one of your pieces, you mentioned exactly that. Do you want to maybe talk about that for a second?
That's exactly right. I mean, foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, really doesn't exist anymore. We have a domestic policy that covers the entire world, and there are deep roots to that. So the historian Angelo Codevilla traces this all the way back to Wilsonianism, and you can see the deep roots of it in a kind of crusading early 20th century progressivism. But I don't think it's necessary to go back that far to understand it necessarily. I really think that 9/11 was the pivotal event in terms of this. And while it might seem like that was the last sort of definitive foreign policy, in a lot of ways, actually, it was an extension of a Cold War era framework that wasn't able to be successfully shaken off in time to avoid what ended up being the disaster of the War on Terror. And what you got in the War on Terror was an inability to conceive, to come back to an earlier point we were talking about, that is conceiving of the national interest and seeing the economy as something that should serve the national interest, should serve the nation and its citizens. There was an inability to conceive of how to prosecute, the action against the terrorists responsible for 9/11 and the states that had backed them in a way that was primarily designed to serve the national interest. And what would that mean? It would mean returning America to a state of peace and prosperity, which is the classical goal of warfare. Is not to, we've lost sight of this, but the classical goal of warfare is not to remake the world in our own image. It is to preserve our way of life as distinct from the rest of the world. And very early on, the War on Terror was conceived of. I wrote a long article actually combining a lot of what we're talking about now for American Affairs. I think it's called Data-Driven Defeat in Afghanistan, talking about the ways in which sort of informational management systems had obscured the inability to pursue a strategic path to victory in Afghanistan. And part of what I trace in that piece is the way that from very early on, the leadership, Rumsfeld, Bush, others, had abandoned the idea of prosecuting the war in such a way that it could be won so that we could then get back to peace in America, and had instead pursued this idea of a long war that took as the prerequisite of victory the utter and absolute transformation of the Middle East and of Afghanistan into societies remade in our own image. And that was, I think, as we could see how by that war ended, a foolhardy mission, to say the least. In so doing that, sort of warfare and foreign policy became like, sort of detached from reasonably achievable goals. And they became amorphous, inflationary, sort of indefinite states. Obama famously said at one point in reference to Afghanistan, we shouldn't talk about victory because that's how they used to talk about it, but we don't storm beaches anymore, and this is postmodern warfare now, and so it's misleading and dangerous to talk about victory. And so what that ended up leading to is this sort of state of indefinite warfare, of indeterminate, are we at war, aren't we at war? At the same time, the American political system, having taken the entire world now as its stage, pursued a series of policies that are starting, I would say, with 9/11 and then accelerating under the Obama administration, pursued a series of sort of bizarre combination of attempts at transformative changes in the strategic orientation of the U.S. So elevating Iran under Obama at the expense of traditional allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, while at the same time seeing other parts of the world as sort of, stages or often piggy banks for extractive U.S. policies to enrich a elite ruling class in the U.S. And that's the story we're stuck with now. So our policies in Ukraine is the definitive example of this, right? Ukraine, where the president's son had business relations. I mean, it's funny that the natural shock of Joe Biden meddling in Ukraine's judicial system in business that his son was involved with, that ought to still be, you ought to think that's bizarre and shocking, but there are so many layers of influence operation and narrative distortion and spin on top of it that I feel like now when you say it, people's first reaction is like, that's a right-wing meme, right? But these things actually happened. And at the very least, they're weird, right?
Yeah, but just to pause you there for a second, I would say that that's exactly expressing an international affair as an expression of a domestic political priority. I mean, yes, there's obviously Biden-esque hijinks. That said, Russian armor invaded Ukraine and encircled Kyiv, and there was the biggest war since World War II happening on European soil, right? And like, in some sense, the point of raising this point about the outside world seeming to be like Plato's cave of American political issues is that there is a reality out there that's different than the Biden story. And in some sense, the American attitude towards that outside reality is more a function of that outside reality than it is the inside reality. Although I know that's not a common opinion. Getting back to the unnamed members of this group chat, actually, Dan, I think you probably agree with this belief a little bit. You know, America should just pull away from its overseas commitments. It should be inward facing. This is, speaking of the four veins, whatever Walter Russell Mead's analysis of like four veins of American thought, we mentioned Wilsonianism. Another is Jacksonian isolationism, right? That's very nativist, very pro-America. Like, we've got the world's at arm's length. Who cares? Retract everything. The problem with that attitude is that at some point reality comes and bites you. And the reality is that America does live in an American world order. And the tech companies in San Francisco, the reason why Facebook is Facebook and not VKontakte, right, which is the Facebook of Russia, is because we live in an American world order and American products have an American market in the way that other regional hegemons do not, right? And in some sense, that world market goes away if we don't actually maintain that order. And if that means potentially supplying the Ukrainians or making sure Taiwan doesn't get involved with the Chinese, that's the price we pay. But I think I could see it being argued either way. I think, to me, the counter argument to the Zehan thing is that, again, the U.S. is not actually going to pull away from world leadership. It's just going to get dumber, right? And not going to understand outside issues because it parses the Ukraine issue as like a Biden domestic presidential issue, right? Or something closer to home, Israel, right? But speaking of Biden placed as a precondition to any deal with the Saudis, resolving the Palestinian issue. I'm putting in air quotes because we've been hearing about this for 30 years and there is no resolution. As a side note, one thing that struck me about being in Israel doing this massive protest back and forth, nobody even mentioned the Palestinians, right? As a domestic issue, the Palestinians almost don't matter anymore. They've been sort of contained. They're irrelevant. They just don't matter. Like, the Jews are basically fighting amongst themselves, and then the Palestinians, even though things are kind of hot, right, in the West Bank, and there's a lot of shootings, a lot of killings and reprisals, and a lot of stuff going on. Actually, it's not like things are quiet, and yet nobody mentions them. And so, but I would say it's another example in which the American, and you know this better than I do, Jacob, the American view of Israel is like 20 years behind. The thought that there's going to be a two-state solution, like any of these fantasies from the Obama era, are completely fantastical and delusional, and just are just irrelevant. Unless, of course, the American Secretary of State thinks that it's operative, and they stick their fingers in it, and suddenly it changes things. But that's another example where I'll cite where it's like, yeah, Americans can pull away and just not give a shit about the outside world, but then they're going to play a role in the Middle East anyhow and get it totally wrong, and that to me is the problem.
But these projections of American, it's two things. It's a projection of American domestic political priorities and political agendas. So it's the bizarre attempt to transpose, frameworks that barely make sense in America, but at least have currency in America, onto places where they make absolutely no sense at all. It's that combined with what are, in many cases, like straightforwardly extractive policies that are intended to draw resources out of these places to enrich the American ruling class. In the case of Ukraine, where this gets so difficult and so sort of lost, like in a almost paradoxical set of relationships, is that you have both of these things occurring at the same time. A very real Russian invasion, a huge country invading a small sovereign country, the small sovereign country defying the expectations, the totally mistaken expectations of the U.S. intelligence and security establishment, which expected Kyiv to fold within a week and was offering Zelensky airlift out of the country. And the Ukrainians defy that, very bravely fight back against this defense, against this invasion and mount an effective defense. And then you have an American backing of Ukraine and a Ukrainian position on the world stage, very much shaped by that American backing, that is obviously responding to the real event that's taking place, and yet is using it for ends that can't possibly be said to serve Ukrainians in any direct way necessarily, and aren't even about restoring what makes the most sense in terms of a kind of restoring the borders that make the most sense in terms of an American-led international order. So I don't know exactly how to make sense of all this. I don't know exactly how to draw these lines, but the Ukraine seems to me to be the place where these old, pre-influence operation, pre-information warfare realities meet with sort of American, I don't know what you call it, imperial hubris, and also the need for genuine military backing. So it's like all of these things overlaid on top of one another. I don't take the strict isolationist position, and nor do I think that that there was no strategic logic to backing Ukraine. I think there was a strategic logic to backing Ukraine, but the question is, to what end? Is the strategic logic to backing Ukraine to provoke an indefinite war that prompts an even more, an even larger reaction from Russia, or to try and affect regime change in Russia, which a number of senior U.S. officials have said more or less forthrightly at a number of points? It's not clear to what end any of this is occurring anymore.
Sorry, I hate to hog the mic, Erik, but can I? Obviously Israel and Judaism is somewhat of a recurring theme on the show.
Hog it, please.
So, I mean, the other place where American strategic interest is playing a role, where it's maybe a little misguided, obviously, is Israel and Iran, right? It's another place you can cite that's a little closer to home. Here's a thought. I don't know, have you read Dara Horn's work? I'm sure you have, probably. Like, People Love Dead Jews and some of her. For those who don't know, it's a total plug. I actually interviewed her on Pro Request, my previous podcast a while ago. I think she's probably one of the smartest and best writers about American Jewish life today. I think she just gets it in this really cool way. And this book called People Love Dead Jews, I know it's a slightly spicy title, but with a point. I won't try to summarize the entire book, but she does draw some interesting distinctions between sort of Jewish and Christian narratives on reality, right? One of them, to take a near-term example, is obviously the narrative around Anne Frank, right? Perhaps I think she called her the world's second most famous Jew, right, after Jesus, obviously, is Anne Frank, right? And just to summarize very quickly her point, and probably the funniest line in the book, if anyone hasn't been to Anne Frank House, it's like a super touristy location in Amsterdam. They had a Jewish employee, like, a guy at the door or whatever, and he was religiously observant, and he wore a yarmulke, and they asked him to remove it because it might be offensive. And then the best line in the book is, "It took remarkably long for the Anne Frank Museum to realize that forcing Jews into hiding isn't a good idea." And then also on the placards, they have it in various languages. They wouldn't use the Israeli flag on the Hebrew. They would literally use HE or something, even though every other language has a European national flag. Again, not to be offensive and stuff. So the idea here being that the secular world, which is really the post-Christian world, loves holding up Jews as an example of something, and it's typically an expression of, frankly, Christian trauma about its own treatment of Jews, and has nothing to do with actual Jewish narratives, right? And in some sense, the famous Anne Frank line about how, despite it all, I think everyone's a little bit good at heart, is kind of a very Christian view of things, right? That's the Gospels poking out, saying at the end of the day, people are actually good and the kingdom of God will arrive, when in fact it didn't, and Anne Frank actually died, right? And the more Jewish narrative would not have that happy ending to it. Okay, anyhow, that's a very long intro to another point she makes in the book, which is, the Christian and Hebrew Bibles are very different. The Christian Bible obviously is about a happy ending. It's about the happiest ending in the world, right? The return of Jesus and the installment of the kingdom of God on earth. And that the Jewish Bible ends with Moses dying at the Holy Land, doing a little bit of trust and probate work about who gets what, and then dying, and that's it. The whole saga leads to this, and then he just dies, and then there's no resolution.
Without getting in, for people who haven't read to the end.
Without getting in. All this shit, this whole saga, and he just doesn't even get in, right? That is a very Jewish narrative. I wonder, this has always been my secret theory that I've never dared writing about in Tablet, although Lana would probably want me to, that I think in particularly the case of the Israeli narrative, Americans who are the most Christian Westerners like left, right, want a nice little bow on this. They want a two-state solution. They want a viable Palestinian state. They want peace in the Middle East, all that stuff. I think Israelis you talk to now, most of them at least, don't believe that a two-state solution is viable. There will never be peace. There will be war forever. And I think that's much more the Jewish narrative. I think actually in our group, Dan, I think I assailed the group with, again, my random Israeli history points. The famous speech that Moshe Dayan gave at the funeral oration, which is like the Gettysburg Address in Israel, as I understand it. Everyone learns it. At the death of, I forget his name, Roy Rotberg or something, who was just, a guy who was a guard in a kibbutz close to Gaza, and then he was ambushed and murdered, as many Israelis have been. And there's a famous line there. He says, "This is our future forever. Lest the sword fall from our hands, then our nation fall." Right? Like it was this very sort of grim, cynical acceptance that Israel would be at war forever, and that in fact, even assuming that we would let the sword fall from our hands would be an item of national danger. How much do you lend any credence to that theory that there's just different religious narratives in people's heads about what is possible in the Middle East today? And the Americans are running with one piece of software that says there's a happy ending coming, and the Israelis are running with a different piece of software that says, remember Amalek and let not the sword fall from our hands.
I mean, I don't even think it's a theory. I buy it 100%. I don't think it's just that Americans believe in happy endings. Well, of course, Americans do believe in happy endings. The primary, maybe the principal American belief from which all others flow is the supreme power of America to fix things, to solve things, to advance the world. And so the American attitude toward the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is not just like it needs a happy ending. It's also, we can fix this. And what this is missing, what this needs, the reason why it hasn't been fixed yet is Americans. Like, we're the thing that will fix this. And that had been the approach taken by, I don't know, what is it, 5 successive White Houses. The attitude in Israel, I think, is certainly resigned to the idea. Look, certainly like the Oslo roadmap to 2 states, nobody believes in that anymore. There are a couple of hangers-on. Actually, if you find somebody in Israel who still talks to you about a sort of Oslo-style roadmap to 2 states, you know that they're on Western payroll, right? Like the only people who are still talking like that are people who get paid by, American NGO or European NGOs or something like that. That's, nobody actually believes that anymore except the people whose livelihood depends on believing that, or at least mouthing belief in it. I don't know that I would say, my Hebrew is also terrible, I should say, and I'm new to this country. And so I don't want to pretend to any expertise about the Israeli psyche or anything, but I think that there are possibilities of real, meaningful coexistence, sharing this land that will be substantively improved by a reconciliation between Israel's ascendant national religious and religious political movements and its older secular movements. I actually think there's more hope, more possibility for peace of some kind with the religious movements coming into more power in Israel. But, in general, it has simply taken a sort of backseat in the Israeli political imagination and an Israeli domestic political discourse, even though, the rioting a few years ago, the violence a few years ago, the fact that Lod, which is very close to where I live, there were some violent conflicts there. It shook people up. It hasn't had traction. It hasn't had staying power compared to the unbelievably personal, impassioned sense of like our country is being taken away from us by these people, and it's not the Palestinians, it's religious Jews, it's sort of the equivalent of deplorables in a way.
Jacob, I wanted to ask one question to you because you mentioned it regarding kind of Obama's tack with Iran. My very limited outside observer sense, just reading mainstream media, which is always dangerous, is it seems like that is the singular focus for the Israeli foreign policy is, put the reconciliation with the Sunni countries, the relationship with Iran, or how Iran is, meddling in Lebanon, funding whatever, kind of groups in Gaza or the West Bank. I'm curious how the secular side and the right, is there any alignment on Iran, or is there actually, how does that play out?
Yeah, there's very little daylight between the two on that. Look, it's not surprising, right? Like if you're encircled by a hostile country that's pledged to your destruction and is funding Hamas in Gaza, is funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, so to your south, to your north, and now effectively controls Syria as a satrapy, that's where everybody is going to be focused. So it's not, I don't think it speaks to anything more consequential about deeper alignments between the left and the right. It's just like you would have to be very crazy or very original and bold in your sense of the world to see things. And I happen to know somebody who does see things a bit differently. So I've gone to visit I was about to say famous military historian, he might be famous, named Martin Van Creveld, who wrote a book called The Transformation of War, and he's developed a theory of post-Clausewitzian warfare. He's very brilliant, prescient in many ways, military historian. And, he has been somebody who has been sort of critical of the focus on Iran and has said that the threat has been overinflated, but he's a real outlier in this regard. Though I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's quite brilliant. I also think he's wrong about this, but for the most part, that's how everybody sees it. The real difference is, and this comes back to the way in which like everything becomes domestic politics within the American arena. The real difference is the people on, let's say, the center left and even some on the center right view the closeness with Washington as the most important security barrier that Israel has vis-a-vis Iran. Bibi and his bloc and Likud, while by no means trying to break the alliance with America, it's absolutely not what Bibi wants to do. And he's cultivated a different kind of alliance where he's made, it's a much more explicitly sort of partisan alliance that Bibi has, some of which is a consequence of the enmity coming from the Obama administration towards him, some of which, is mutual. But the Bibi side sees their preservation of sort of key strategic independence, autonomy, freedom of maneuver as more important than closeness with DC. Now, these are sort of matters of degree on both sides, because the center-left people would insist in public, at least, that they maintain independence, and Bibi would insist in public, at least, that he maintains the sort of vitality, how vital the alliance is. But it's a meaningful distinction between the two sides there.
And so you get the Bibi version with the spy novel level assassinations happening of Israel or Iranian, nuclear scientists, right? It's like the robotic machine gun, the motorcycles, and all that kind of stuff.
You get that. I got to say, have you guys seen the Semaphore piece on Robert Malley? It's by Jay Solomon. It's in Semaphore. And the quick recap is that Robert Malley, who's a holdover from the Obama administration, who until recently was serving at very high levels in the Biden administration, then he got sort of suspended mysteriously 5 months ago. Malley is the guy who's the architect of the nuclear deal with Iran under Obama. He ran an organization called CSIS, Center for Strategic something or another. And, he was seen as not only pro-Iran, he's the son of a very sort of like Nasserite communist father who's, Jewish, communist, like pan-Arabist, virulently anti-Israel, virulently anti-Zionist. But, he's his own man. And so he's the chief architect and the chief negotiator with Iran under the Obama administration. He gets brought in essentially in the exact same role in the Biden administration. So Semaphore just reported like 2 days ago a trove of emails which came from an Iranian government official. So these are emails from Tehran, from the government, that have been authenticated, showing that 3 people who worked with Malley directly, one of whom now serves in a senior position in the Pentagon, were working for a Iranian cutout organization that was conceived of by the Iranian foreign minister Zarif to act as a clearinghouse for pro-Tehran talking points within the Western media establishment. So in other words, Zarif said, like, we need to find people to retail our position on these various things. They identified a number of academics who were like, they thought would be susceptible to this approach. They thought were aligned enough that they would be good candidates. They brought them in, and these emails now show that, like, one of these guys, Ali Fayez, like, writes a letter to an Iranian government official saying, I understand that it's my patriotic duty to help you advance these talking points, essentially. He sends a draft, like the full, complete draft of an article that he's going to publish. There's another academic who volunteers to write articles for Iranian administration officials. Anyway, the point is, like, 3 of these people work directly for Malley. One of them continues to be employed at a very high level at the Pentagon, and I forget if it was a White House Spox or the Pentagon Spox report was like, we're not worried about this. It happened in 2014. Now, the people in the media, of course, who lost their minds over the nonsense in the Steele dossier, are all poo-pooing this and saying it's not a big deal. It's basically racist to even talk about it, and it's a smear, and it's pro-Israel Hasbara, and whatever else. And it's Zionist settler colonialism to even mention the fact that 3 people working for Robert Malley were also essentially operating through a cutout of the government of Iran. So I don't know what better illustration there could be of Antonio's point about the ways in which, the domestic politics has just totally subsumed everything else. If you had any real sense of statecraft, of there being an America that had, if not enemies, competitors in the world, if that you were trying to exercise leadership, like, you probably wouldn't want the top levels of government to be penetrated by foreign agents like that. But it seems like it's, I don't know. I have to trust the wisdom of the people I see saying that it's not a big deal. Apparently, it's not a big deal. So
yeah, that's a screaming red flag. But to get to Dan's earlier point, one of the things I noticed at the head of, for example, the protest that walked from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there's somebody. I have a photo of it. Didn't appear in the story. There's a photo of somebody saying, "Biden, come save us." Right. The interesting thing is that in the Israeli left, the relationship with the United States is still a big deal with the diaspora. They're all living like Clinton's still in power or something. And then the right, and I want to talk about that in a second, because I think what's going on in the Israeli right is novel and interesting and something most Americans don't understand. In the American right, they don't give a shit about the United States at all, right? Like what I'm not going to name names, but what the rabbi says as the sermon in the Park Avenue synagogue, right, on the Upper East Side, matters to a certain class of Israeli. That voice, or the Peter Beenerts of the world, to the Ben Gavirs and the Smotriches of the world, they don't even know where the fuck the Park Avenue synagogue is. And by the way, that's a fake form of Judaism. Why do we care about them, right? And it's this. I think part of the problem, and it's funny, Dan uses this phrase a lot, is that the U.S. has like main character syndrome, because it has been the main character. It certainly wasn't World War II. It certainly wasn't the Cold War. But in certain parts of the world, it actually isn't a main character anymore and has shockingly little influence to actually change matters on the ground, other than the influence that is conceded to them by the players there.
You sound like Balaji, Antonio.
Well, it's true. I mean, sorry, at the end of the day, Israel is the United States' bulldog, if anything, in the Middle East. Do you think Americans are capable of going and machine gunning the head of the Iranian nuclear program and then shuttling people? They're not even, the CIA hasn't done that in 50 years, right? Like at the end of the day, they're not capable of doing anything other than applying outside pressure and media on it, right?
Bulldog and laboratory of innovation, right? Like the U.S. sees Israel as basically free high-tech innovation.
Right. I mean, to your point, you wrote a piece saying that in fact, the U.S. should end the Israeli subsidy. Everyone says the Israeli subsidy. It's bullshit. It's not a subsidy to Israel. Israel doesn't need the money anymore. It's not poor anymore. It's a subsidy to Lockheed Martin. And two, the technology they get back is way more than the money they put into it. Because Israel is the only country that is the only Western country, friendly to the United States, that's actually fighting real wars against non-trivial enemies and not firing guided missiles at some sheep herder in an Afghan mountain or something. Israel is this amazing military laboratory that the U.S. absolutely profits from in a huge way. And anyhow, sorry to hit on another thing because it's going to distract us from the question I did want to ask you, Jake, because I know we're getting to the end of the podcast. But one thing I find interesting about my time that I was in Israel, you mentioned how, before we got on the whole Iranian tangent, how the religious right is kind of this punching bag for the left, or it's really the antagonist they look at. One thing I noticed is that the Haredi, which for those who don't know, it's like the guys with the black hats and the black coats, like the people that you see in like Brooklyn that you associate with quote unquote ultra-Orthodox, which is not a name I agree with, but whatever, the ultra-Orthodox, right, are the Haredi, and that they're always kind of like the boogeyman, at least in the secular left's Israeli mindset, right, the Haredi. But I think one thing you've seen recently developed that I think is actually the most interesting thing in Israeli politics, I mean, Micah Goodman has written an entire book about this, right, is the rise of religious Zionism, right? And again, for those who aren't super familiar with what that means, because it sounds like, wait, the religious or Zionist, isn't it the same thing? Like, no, it's actually totally oxymoronic, right? If you know, just very quickly, if you know about the history of Israel, Israel was founded by secular socialists who were not observant at all. Try and find a picture of Ben Gurion with a kippah on his head. You won't find one, right? And in fact, the Haredi, who had suffered tremendously under the Holocaust, were seen as like the repositories of true Orthodox Judaism because there weren't that many other Orthodox Jews around. And so they were conceded all these benefits that you have to the present day. They control marriage in Israel and a bunch of other things. But what you find that's interesting is you're finding people who don't live the isolated lives of the Haredi, right? The Haredi, by the way, do not believe in the state that they consider to be too secular, which is why they don't serve in the army. It's like, no, you've got people who are observant and as Orthodox as anything, but their children serve in the army, they pay taxes, they have real jobs, and there's a lot of them. There's like something like 20 to 25, more than there are Haredi. And yet you talk to the secular, and it's always about the Haredi who are avoiding taxes and avoiding the army, which is a legitimate grievance, to be clear. Like, I agree. It's a little bit of a, like, what the hell sort of thing. But what they refuse to address, because they can't address it, right, is like, what do you do with, again, religious Zionists, modern Orthodox, Mizrahi, who are not secular, and they don't want part of the Tel Aviv spirit, right? But you can't actually point to them and say, well, you don't pay taxes and you don't serve. They do pay taxes and they do serve. They just are not falling for the inducements of secular liberal society as you have. And I think against that, they just don't know what to say. And so they don't tend to address it, even though, again, I think it's much more important right now than like what's going on with Haredi. What do you make of that, or what's your thought on that?
So to just heighten a few of those distinctions, there are a few minor exceptions, but for the most part, the Haredim don't only not serve in the army. Some of them explicitly don't accept the legitimacy of the state, based on the idea that it wasn't supposed to be, man was not supposed to bring the Jews back from the exile to Israel, that was supposed to be the Messiah. So there are not insignificant number of Haredi in Israel who have made their peace with living in the state, but still some of them are, there's a tiny minority that's like explicitly, virulently anti-state, and they get off, they're the ones who there's 50 documentaries about them. The Neturei Karta, people love to hold them up because they're, explicitly anti-Zionist, but they're like a marginal group. There's a much larger group who just don't view the state as the full rightful authority, even if they've made their peace with it. The religious Zionists are, not only are they more politically significant, they're becoming more politically significant every year, as they have been doing since 1967. So after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, that sort of reconquer of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, there's been a enormous growth in not only demographic growth, but also an important sort of march through the institutions has a bad connotation, but spread of influence of religious Zionists through different institutions in the army, in political life, and civic life. And, you said at the beginning that like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir don't care what the Park Avenue rabbi says, and that's true. But, they're legitimately extreme and in some ways noxious characters, outliers. Much more moderate religious Zionists also don't care. And they don't care because they're contemptuous of what the Park Avenue rabbi says. They really don't care. It doesn't occur to them to care. I have found, somewhat to my surprise, that many of them are sort of taken aback when they are appraised of the degree of estrangement from Israel from sort of Jewish establishment types, because it doesn't occur to them to seek approval. So they haven't even caught up to the fact that there's this much approbation. To your basic point about, the secular Zionist left's inability to deal with that. This is, for me, it's something inside my own family that I deal with. My relations in Israel are very much on the secular, secular going back like to the founding of the state and before it side of things. And they are really wonderful people who I love, but they have a view of their right to rule Israel that has not accommodated their loss of power and significance. And I would say that the way they deal with the religious Zionists is first just by lumping them in with the Haredim, and secondly by blaming them for sort of demonizing them in the same way that the American left might for persecuting the Palestinians and for preventing, the achievement of the two-state solution. So they might say to you, yes, it's true, Oslo couldn't work and Arafat, betrayed the promise of Oslo, and they might say all that, but they'll also say to you, and the religious settlers made it impossible, and they persecute the Palestinians, not without some justification for that. But, the accommodation that has to be reached, and I should also add one more point, and recognizing that their ideology is moribund, right? Like if you talk to these people who are marching in the streets are marching for themselves as a people and for their place in Israel, but they have no movement other than opposition to losing ground, other than opposition to Bibi. There's not an ideology that animates them. It's like, neoliberal, centrist stuff, boilerplate stuff. Hence you get a Biden save us sign, right? Like no self-respecting movement with any sense of itself waves around a Biden save us sign. But if you talk to the people who recognize this and who know that the old left-wing secular Zionist movement is moribund, what they'll say to you is, we have tech. We're the startup nation. And this is where I feel that there is an urgent need to reconcile high tech in Israel, to the country's true purpose, to its national ethos, and to not allow it to become a superstructure, political superstructure, a surveillance superstructure. And that's a bit cryptic, but I think it's important.
Which is funny. It's like the most neoliberal thing to say, right? In some sense, to say, well, but we're the economy, so kind of screw you, right? And the reality is that places into very sharp relief the decision. I think, I mean, we're painting with very broad brushstrokes here, but I think many in the religious right in Israel would prefer to be more religious and less, perhaps, spectacularly economically successful, right? While the left, of course, well, what do you mean? We're just going to take our little startup toys away, and that's the end of it. But you're right that the left doesn't, like, I was at the end of the march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They set up a stage in front of the Knesset. Like the leaders, what's his name, Rodman, I've already forgotten their names, whatever. The 3 or 4 leaders who have sprung up in the WhatsApp groups as leaders gave speeches, and it was completely empty and vapid. I mean, they sang Hatikva, like the Israeli national anthem and whatever. Like, there's some social fabric there, but there's no message, there's no platform, right? It's just no to the just we're pro democracy, even though we're subverting a democratic result, and that's it. And then this is what it is. There's not much of a there, and but that's why it's so interesting, because it really is kind of, I know it sounds cliche, but a fight over the soul of the nation. I mean, I think Liel and Tablet made the illusion that is like, is it a Jewish state or a state for Jews? And that is the debate. And funny, you present it that way to leftists, and they're like, no, it's not that. It's about democracy.
Listen, did you see the article in Haaretz last week? In Israeli Haaretz. So the editor-in-chief of the Israeli edition of Haaretz, Aleph Ben, wrote an article. It's time to get rid of Jewish, take Jewish out of the Jewish state. This is the editor-in-chief of the premier left-wing, center-left, Mapai, Avodah, like continuity Israeli left publication, said it's time to fully divorce. And, he's still ahead of like where my cousins in Beersheba are, but that's planting the flag. That's where it's going. Liel was exactly right in that piece.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny. I caught a decent amount of flack for my piece. Oh, you're just an outsider. You don't understand it. And like every Haaretz headline I've seen since then is only confirmed, frankly. So I didn't find the piece you're referring to, but like Google randomly linked me to a different piece, which is even more shocking. That's called "It's Time for Us Jews to Go Back into Exile." It's like, man.
Yes. Now that's somebody who's trying to win supporters and build broad coalitions, right? That's not like a weird, narrow, fetishistic appeal.
It's funny. We've gone so far. I don't know if you saw the movie. Maybe we can end the podcast with a movie plug. The movie Golda, the biopic with Helen Mirren.
I did not.
It's funny. At the time, I didn't think it was so amazing. It's kind of grown on me, I have to say. It's one of these films that goes better with age as it sort of curdles in your mind and you remember scenes. Anyhow, in there, I think somewhere it quotes or alludes to the famous Golda Meir quote that if the choice is between being dead and pitied or alive and considered problematic, then we're going to go for the latter, right? And that was obviously the philosophy that led Israel through all of its existential crises. And I think that the movie, by the way, is pretty good because it's a little weird, again, but it really is a picture of a woman who, despite being assailed by doubt and ill health, sort of provided the steel spine when the country was sort of shell-shocked in its moment of most existential peril, right? So it's an interesting look at what that must be, being inside that. But in any case, we've gone from that world of, well, we'd rather be alive and disliked, to one where, no, we're going to voluntarily go back into exile. Because, forget this whole Jewish state business. It's just too complicated and weird. And, our friends in America don't like it. So screw that.
But, I think like you can turn that sort of indifference to world opinion, which is a healthy instinct insofar as it goes, into an excuse for an excuse for not dealing with the contradictions and problems of your own society. And some of that happened in Israel and needed to be addressed also. So, without adopting the let's throw ourselves at the mercy of enlightened world opinion. The the sort of purely like realpolitik Israeli approach toward not only the region but its own place in the world and in the region as a whole. Like Israel needed a spiritual crisis. It needs this conflict. There needs to be an accommodation reached. There needs to be an accommodation reached between religious Israelis and secular Israelis. Both should feel that it's fully their country. I mean, I am, more sympathetic to the sort of religious side of this in political terms, but it's a country for both groups, and there also needs to be an accommodation with Palestinians, and that can go on the back burner. It can be less important than Iran in strategic terms, but it doesn't just go away. So it's a difficult moment, but a necessary one. I hope it leads to a kind of breakthrough.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to take a sort of cautionary tale, right? If you look at history, the longevity of independent Jewish statehood has been remarkably short-lived throughout 3,000 years. And typically the downfall has been external pressure, but actually really infighting amongst Jews. If you read, Josephus's The Jewish War, about the infighting that happened during the siege of Jerusalem and how the Romans ultimately triumphed because the Jews turned on each other. It's a very cautionary tale about what you see today when Israel is being threatened by its long-term enemy, the Persians, and not the Romans. There's one question I would ask all the secular lefties in Israel, because it's like they have all these objections and all this and protests. But it's like, all right, dude, like this is your little Supreme Court drama now. Fast forward 30 years from now, right? Israel's getting more right wing. It's getting more religious. Where would you see the settler population in the West Bank or Judea, Samaria, however you prefer to refer to it, is only increasing, right? Where do you see Israel in, say, 30, 40 years? Like, not like warning extreme case, like most likely outcome, the mode of the distribution. Where do you see it in 30 or 40 years?
I don't know. I find that too hard to answer. I mean, the truth is I just extrapolate out from the present, and I think like some version of sort of stalemate not so far off from the one we have now seems possible to me. A more hopeful outcome would involve, a sort of a real accommodation reached between secular and religious Israelis, where the country becomes more religiously Jewish in its character without alienating secular people or imposing on them, which I think people assume that that's a contradiction in terms, but I think it's actually possible. And so I think that there could be a country that, Israel could be the model post-secular society in that way. And at the same time, there could be some kind of real reconciliation with Palestinians, who I think are, are also like, you say that Israelis are exhausted with two states. I think Palestinians are exhausted too. And, Hamas and violent resistance captures that energy because, first of all, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is so captured and inept and corrupt. And also because there's so little alternative, but there are scenarios where, there's some kind of federalized system or something that allows people who want to live in the land of Israel to live in the land of Israel without having to be permanently at war with each other. As long as we're projecting out, I wouldn't call that likely. Like that's not where I would place money. It's not where I think the betting odds are necessarily. The betting odds are something like the present, but a bit worse.
Very Jewish attitude.
Possible. Yeah, but it is possible, and I think ultimately more likely under a more religious political leadership in Israel than under the current framework.
Okay, I think my projection, to the extent I can project, is probably very similar to yours. I'm slightly more optimistic. I do think a reconciliation is possible. One of the points of my piece is that secular Israelis are not nearly as secular as they think they are. They're more observant than your average American Jew. They all do Shabbat. They're very Jewy for being in tech in Tel Aviv. They're way more Jewy than your average American Jew. And I don't think there's actually such a wide gulf actually between secular Jews and more observant Jews in Israel. I think there will be a reconciliation. I think the country will get more religious and more right wing. I think the secular left, some of them will leave. Some of them, it's going to be the proverbial moving to Canada if Trump won. They're not going to move. I think some of those who do move are going to have the shock of their lives because the diaspora mentality is real, right? To the extent that I've spent a few years I just got to this party, but it's very different. The Jew in America acts and reacts and lives very differently than the Jew in Israel, right? To cite a weird analogy to Americans if they don't get it, a Jew in Israel is like a Cuban in Miami, right? They walk around, they're not even conscious of the fact that they own the place. The entire culture is theirs. They don't even realize that there's another diaspora Cuban who lives in the United States and struggles about his Latinx identity. He's like, who the fuck is that? Who the fuck cares? As he sits there and sips his little café con leche and just doesn't even think about it, right? It's very different to be a Cuban living in Spokane, Washington, or whatever in Pennsylvania. You've got all these crises. You got a lot, it's this whole other thing, right? And I think your average Israeli Jew doesn't realize that. Never mind wearing a kippah in Europe and getting harassed and shit, all that crap. They're not going to deal with, right? As much as they want to go back and live in this, whatever the secular world. So I think a lot of that, we're leaving, is not going to happen. I think the West Bank situation is going to get more along the same trend line as it is now. I mean, I drove through the West Bank in 2005, and I mean, to be blunt, it's weird that we talk about the two-state solution. It was already functionally annexed at the time. All the highways were controlled by the army. I mean, there's certain cities that you couldn't go to, but by and large, it was shocking to me how much the West Bank felt like, oh, this is just an extension of Israel, obviously. And this is almost 20 years ago. Now it's only gone to be, now that the settler number is, I don't know what the multiple is, but it's a much larger number than it used to be. And that number is only set to increase. If not even for religious reasons, just for real estate reasons. Tel Aviv is super expensive. It's more expensive than San Francisco when it comes to real estate, which is crazy, right? Because the salaries just don't justify those costs if you don't work in tech. And so more and more people are going to be pushed into the West Bank. And I don't know, I think 30 years from now, you're just going to have a slightly more religious country. The Jews will still be fighting. The Palestinians will be there. Israel will look more and more like from the river to the sea. And then that'll be that. That's probably and then of course there's going to be some external enemy like Iran or somebody else, because there always is, because it's Israel. And then life will just muddle on and there won't be a happy ending. It'll be like the end of the Hebrew Bible, but maybe I'm being optimistic.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, given the podcast I'm on right now, is that I think Israel has to be very wise and deliberate in how it handles its tech economy and in how it leverages strategic tech. And I say this as somebody who, views the net effect of the concentration of let's say, digital technologies, political and economic power in the U.S. as a force that has, leave aside whether it's like a net negative or a net positive, it has not been well managed by the American political class. It has been very, very poorly managed by the American political class in a way that has increased political polarization and social breakdown. And but America's a vast country with considerable resources and natural defenses and hundreds of millions of people, and we can just make mistakes and absorb them. And Israel doesn't have that luxury. So that's my word of caution.
Cool. With that, Erik, should we close?
Yeah. Let's wrap on that. Jacob, this has been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.